On a beautiful day like today, filled with the rich, warm colors of autumn, it's easy to understand the Impressionist painter's fascination with light and the landscape. I'm Barbara Cohenauer. Join me at Philbrook Museum for Focus on Art. My guest is Richard Townsend. Richard is the Hardman Curator of European and American Art. Richard, welcome to Focus on Art.
Well, thank you, Barbara.
We're delighted to be here for the masterworks of American Impressionism from the Feil collection. And before we see the show, tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I'd be pleased to. The Feil collection in this, that is the focus of this current exhibition at Philbrook, is one of the most important private collections of American Impressionist painting in existence. It has been traveling the country, a few stops before us. There have been a few stops before Tulsa, and the last it came from New York City, the National Academy of Design, to Tulsa, and then it will be seen for the next few years throughout the United States and Europe.
Oh, great. Well, it sounds like it's going to be a wonderful show. Of course, it seems to me like American Impressionism is just now coming into its own.
It is, really. I mean, I suppose one could regard this exhibition as the culmination of years and years, decades of work on 19th century American painting, late 19th century American painting, specifically that called Impressionism. For a long time it was considered the poor stepchild of French Impressionism and regarded as repetitive, so it was not anything to be paid attention to or studied. And thanks to the efforts of a few scholars, curators, and dealers, it has now been revived and has taken its place as an extremely important movement in the history of American art.
Great. Well, there's certainly no art style, I think, that has more appeal to people in general. I mean, you have to be real hard-hearted not to like Impressionism. It's beautiful, the colors, right, the techniques, and so forth. But
there is some significance underlying all that beauty, which I think is important to realize, and we'll try to discover as we walk through the show.
Well, let's get to the show.
Very good. I would like to tell you a little about the owner of these paintings, Richard Feil. He is a Chicago commodities investor, broker, very well-to-do, and he assembled this collection of about 85 paintings you see in this show in the 1980s, which is really fascinating because this was at the height of the market before the crash of the art market a few years ago, and you know, at the time where these paintings were very hard to get, you know, great examples of these particular artists, and also when you'd find a great example that you'd want for your collection, it was an incredible, had an incredible price tag. So it was quite a feat, I think, for this couple, the Feils of Chicago, to assemble such a fine collection as you see here today.
Well, it is a beautiful collection.
It is, and I'd like to start off with this first example. The exhibition is divided into several categories. The first, and these categories trace the development of American Impressionism, or Impressionism in America, from approximately 1885 or 1886, the mid-1880s, to, I think the latest painting we have is about 1920. So there's a span of quite a few decades here.
Right.
But there's a few paintings in this show that you'll see in this, that you see in this first gallery that set the stage. And this first category is called Forerunners and Founders, and they're artists that you don't necessarily associate with Impressionism per se. And this is the first one I'd like to point out, the first exhibition, first painting in the exhibition by George Inness.
And I certainly don't think of Inness as an Impressionist.
No, but let me explain to you why he might fit into this. Now, this is a late Inness painting of 1887.
Okay.
A spectacular view, as you can see, of a snow-covered hillock with the sunset in the distance, with this high horizon line. It's a very evocative painting, and I think Inness, as you say, is not an Impressionist. He's not considered that. Impressionism, let me just say from the word "go" here, is a blanket term. You know, it's a term of convenience, as you know, in art history.
Absolutely.
We tend to categorize people and styles that really aren't able to be compartmentalized so easily. It's for our convenience. But I think that this bears inclusion in the exhibition because here Innes is exploring. He had a very traditional training. He trained in Europe. Interestingly enough, as these Americans who are later to be known as Impressionists did, they went to the birthplace of Impressionism. They went to France.
Right.
But and George Innes did the same thing. He studied in Italy, for example. So he did the grand tour of Europe to hone his art, but and came back to America. And he has that European background, and interesting, but also that conservatism to a degree. I mean, he has that base in the old masters that he saw in Europe. However, in this late painting here, and you can see why it's in this exhibition of Impressionism, here he has he's developed this is late in his career, and he's starting to explore the same sorts of ideas that in a few years the Impressionists would. He's interested in translating onto the canvas issues of atmosphere, light, texture, all these natural phenomena that the Impressionists were so anxious to relay truthfully to the viewer. And Innes is doing the same. He sort of sets the stage. And you can see how he does this through the impasto here, you know, the thick paint that is on top of the canvas, how that gives you the sense of these billowing clouds, or the haze that you have at dusk, where everything starts to become sort of misty and atmospheric. Well, how beautifully he's rendered that here in this canvas.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful canvas.
Yeah. So it begins, it sort of starts us off on that journey of recording the landscape and the one's actual experience of the landscape the Impressionists try to relay to us on canvas. I think Innes starts us off on that journey.
All right. Now, after Innes, we're going to go over here and look at probably one of the very best known of the American painters, and that's John Singer Sargent.
Absolutely.
And doing what he does so well, which is portraiture.
Absolutely, yes. Now, the interesting and key difference here, you're absolutely on the mark when you say that this is portraiture is John Singer Sargent's trademark. But the interesting thing is that this is not, for example, a Grand Society portrait. This is an intimate portrait, a private portrait of a dear friend of his. And in fact, the canvas is inscribed in the upper left hand. If I can read it quickly here, to my friend, Ms. Millet. And this is a portrait of Lilly Millet. And again, Sargent, not necessarily an Impressionist, however, the brushwork that he employed, which was also due to his European exposure, you know, as you well know, Sargent was an expatriate. And like Innes, Innes, like Sargent, had spent some time in Europe, but Sargent most of his life in Europe. And here, his foundation, again, his experience is based in the old masters, particularly the Venetian 16th century. You think of someone like Titian or Veronese with the rich, broad brushstrokes that describe very quickly the figure. So that's here, but at the same time, that still aligns him, or sort of allows him to be seen as a forerunner of the American Impressionists, in that much of his painting is about painting itself. It's not only how wonderfully it describes the sitter, but his painting is also about his technique, how he can capture with a brush in a matter of a second the fold of this wrap of hers, or the light striking her silk skirt. So this bravura brushwork, it also sort of places him in the vanguard of the American Impressionists, in that they were interested, I mean, they used brushwork to describe natural phenomena, as we were saying with the Innes, you know, the effects of light and color and texture. So Sargent belongs to that, in fact, and he was also a friend of Claude Monet, for example. He knew the French Impressionists and the Americans. He also operated in and out of the ambit of James McNeill Whistler, by whom we have an example in this same gallery. And they all were very active in terms of the expatriate Americans that we're going to see in just a moment. They all sort of circulated together. It was all part of this group in Paris that sort of people sort of filtered in and out of, and so these younger artists, these Impressionists we're going to talk about in just a moment, they were absorbing all this influence of the greats. You know, there was Monet, and there was Whistler, and there was Sargent, and so it's all part of this melting pot of art in the 1880s in France. It must have been very exciting.
Richard, out of that melting pot, of course, is one of my personal favorite American artists, and that's Mary Cassatt. One of the earliest women artists that really got out there into the mainstream of painting.
Well, certainly, as you say, one of the best known and best beloved. She was another prominent American in this circle in Paris, and in fact, Mary Cassatt was a great friend of Degas. As you may know, the painter of ballet girls and bathers and horses. I mean, he captured a unique side of Paris, I think sort of what one would call the demi-monde, those that inhabited this half-world of ballet dancers and bathers and prostitutes, and sort of the hard side of Paris. Different with Cassatt, though, isn't it? She portrays a sweeter, domestic scaled. And perhaps we can think of her in terms of Degas. First of all, Degas loved to work in pastel, as you know, and here we have his medium so brilliantly mastered by the student, so to speak, or at least the friend, his friend Mary Cassatt. But also, and again, the accent on the feminine. Degas was fascinated by women. So is Mary Cassatt. But not the harder side, as we were talking about, but here we have the sweeter, domestic side. And I'm sure she got that domestic scale from Degas, but made it something totally her own. Again, the American Impressionists weren't slavish imitators of the French. They truly made the art form their own. And we can see it beautifully in the way she adapts this warm medium, this pastel medium, to this very warm, intimate subject. So it's a perfect, I think, unification of the medium conveying the message. And finally, we should put Mary Cassatt in a context. She was an important conduit for Impressionism being received in America. She brought some of the first works by Degas to America. It certainly spread the news of the Impressionists working in Paris. So this was her achievement, as well as being one of the great women artists to truly, I believe you said earlier, to get the ball rolling, or to bring women artists into the mainstream.
Right. Well, certainly a lovely painting. Now, our next work that we want to look at is also by a woman artist.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see this. This exhibition has several women artists, just not Cassatt and this example by Lilly Cavett Perry, but it's a wonderful achievement to see women active and so important, playing such important roles, and you can see that in this show from the Feil collection of American Impressionism. This example, Lilly Cavett Perry, along with Mary Cassatt, it's interesting to see these two women be so integral to the development of this movement, Impressionism in America, and Perry was just as important. She was from Boston, and Boston became the locus, the important center for the dissemination of Impressionism from France to America. It was centered around Boston and then throughout the United States. And we'll even see some Midwestern painters here. So it spread far and wide, the interest in Impressionism and its strategies, the exploration of the landscape, and the conveyance of natural phenomenon through paint. And in this example, you see something we've been talking about this, the French Impressionists. Well, exactly where did the birthplace? Well, let me phrase it this way: the birthplace of American Impressionism, as you might suspect, is in France, and it was in Giverny, the home place of Claude Monet, the great French landscape painter. And here you can see Perry painting one of the same subjects that Monet explored over and over again in his famous series paintings, these serial paintings in which he explored, sometimes at different times of the day, the effects of light and atmosphere on the same subject matter, and in this case a haystack. So Perry is interested in exploring the same sorts of things. She spent 10 summers 10 years in a row, every summer, starting in 1889, going to Giverny, Monet's hometown. This Giverny, by the way, is just a few miles, 40 or so, outside Paris.
Okay.
And these Americans, Perry, Theodore Butler and Theodore Robinson were amongst the first generation, we call them, of Americans to go to Giverny to study French Impressionism at the master's feet.
Great. Okay, now where do we go from this initial group?
We're going to explore the second generation of Giverniites, as they were called, the next wave of Americans invading France.
All right.
And then we'll move from there.
Okay. Well, now we have another gallery that's just filled with beautiful paintings. But you just want to talk about a couple in here.
Right. I'll pick the two that speak to the next two developments in American Impressionism.
Okay.
Let's start with the Frieza here, the Frederick Frieza. Remember I talked about the first generation of Giverniites, those Americans that went to Giverny to study at the foot of the master.
Yes. Okay.
Well, here we have the second generation, exemplified by this painting by Frederick Frieza. It's called Sun and Wind. It is a beautiful, again, our favorite word for this show,
Absolutely.
Beautiful rendering, this lush impression of an afternoon in a garden. A beautiful woman standing with her parasol on a sunny day in a blooming garden. And this is something you might expect to see in a Monet, at least in terms of the flora. Mm-hmm. Monet, you remember from his paintings, painted these elaborate, lush gardens, his Japanese footbridge, this rich tapestry of colors and forms that the flowers provided. So we see this being picked up here, that interest in using. Here, Frieza really uses it as a backdrop to the central theme of this beautiful woman with a parasol. Monet eventually, certainly, ended up focusing on the garden itself, almost as its own entity. You didn't see any figures in it. He was interested in the garden for the elements of color and shape and rhythm, texture, all those sorts of things that it presented to him. He abstracted it in a sense. Here, Frieza doesn't do that, but at any rate, Frieza, I need to emphasize here, was part of that second generation of Americans to go to Giverny and study there. Frieza is from the Midwest, so you can see now, we were talking about these Boston painters, Philadelphia painters. Now we see this influence of Impressionism by the 1890s or so, really fanning out from the eastern seaboard and influencing artists from the Midwest now, and as far west as you could get in America in those days. So here you have an example by Frieza that speaks to the increased interest in Middle America. This artist then going to France and studying, being part of that second generation, along with people like Lawton Parker, who's also represented in this room. He was from Missouri. There's Edward Greason. He's yet another of these second generation painters. So you have that further development, but the final, I think, final step in the American dependence on the European mode.
Okay, I understand.
Then the next stage of in the history of this period is can be roughly referred to as Impressionism Ascendant. At least that's what I've titled it in this show. And it's exemplified by this work by J. Alden Weir. Now, we are looking at artists that pretty much stayed to their own now. That we've had these several generations, as we've discussed, of Americans going to Europe and needing that as a catalyst. Now we're going to be looking for the next at the next few paintings of Americans that were American. They stayed in America, and they took on Impressionism as their own style. It was no longer viewed as, at least in their eyes, as a European one.
All right.
And in this painting, it's called Peacock Feathers of 1909. Weir, by the way, is interesting. His brother was a painter too, John Weir.
Okay.
So, but this is by J. Alden Weir. And this actually, like the Frieza we just looked at, is a depiction of a beautiful, very sedate, serene woman. The colors are quiet. It's tonal. And what I mean by that is you don't have the predominance of many colors. What is predominant is just the sort of homogeneous, I don't want to use it negatively, but this sort of overall tonality for it. This beautiful sort of blue-green of her silk dress, and you see how that's repeated here in the background, which takes off from that blue-green. It's a slightly different color, but all in all, it's this one sort of tonal, sort of not quite monochromatic, but very serene, peaceful picture, as it's enabled by this sort of cool one-color effect. And it also speaks of a particular aesthetic in late 19th century American art, and that was called the aesthetic era. And that was where artists loved to depict beautiful women, again, with lovely accoutrements like this Renaissance style chair, example of which you can see in the villa, and we have Italianate furniture like this, and this shock of peacock feathers, from which really he derives the entire color scheme. You know, that wonderful iridescent blue-green from the eye of the peacock. See how he uses throughout.
Great.
But this brings up an interesting subject, this lovely aesthetic depiction of a woman with beautiful art objects and furniture. This, I think, brings to the fore the question, why do we constantly see in this exhibition, for example, in the works of the American Impressionists, beautiful women in gardens? I mean, we were talking about Degas and the hard side of Paris, the prostitutes, the barmaids, the drunkards in cafes, the entertainment, nightlife. I mean, this sort of the harder, seamier side of Paris. Why don't we see that in American pictures? And Bill Gertz, the scholar who wrote the catalog to this exhibition, has been very astute in pointing out that when the works of Degas and Renoir and Manet were exhibited in America for the first time in the 1880s, remember I mentioned the Boston show, then they had a later, even more important show of French Impressionists in New York, and the critics went to these shows and they said, this is unacceptable, as there's a principle in art that has to do with decorum. What is proper to be painted? What should we see? What should artists who deal on such an elevated level, what should they depict for us, and what do we want in our own homes? And the critics didn't like this. They didn't like these French showing the dénouement, the harder, seamier side of Paris, the realistic side. And so that's why at least Professor Gertz proposes that American artists retreated from that sort of subject matter. It was not well received critically. And quite frankly, being an artist also has to do with keeping yourself alive and selling paintings.
Okay.
So they painted paintings that were more acceptable to the American public.
Great.
So that's why it's all very lovely and peaceful and all, but it's interesting to ask yourself, but why so much of this? Why the pretty women in gardens with parasols? And this may be probably the reason why, because it was not considered acceptable to late 19th century American public.
All right, so we have the artists being driven by the marketplace to some extent. Now, are we going to have more examples of that?
I think so. We'll see what we come up with.
Well, you certainly have a number of school children here today. Many tours, very popular exhibit.
Absolutely, and that's what we like to see. One of our main missions, of course, is to be here for school children, college students. So it's gratifying to see so much of a popular reaction and see so many people here enjoying. This next gallery, we're in the third gallery now of the painting exhibition, and it is concerned with the regionalists.
Okay.
On this left wall here, we have works of the Eastern regionalists.
All right.
You have people working in Massachusetts and Connecticut,
Okay.
up in New England, further up in New England, and this room really serves to explain or to demonstrate the increased popularity, as I was saying in the previous gallery, this spread of Impressionism now across the country.
All right.
So we have those practicing on the Eastern regionalists, practicing on the East Coast. A few more examples by Theodore Robinson, for example.
And then you have the West Coast on the opposite wall.
Well, further west, yes. We don't have a West Coast painting until the final gallery. But yes, then we have artists working in Ohio, with Edward Pothast, Indiana with Otto Stark, and Barbara, here we have an example by the prominent Western regionalist William Merritt Chase.
Well, certainly one of the best known names in American painting.
Absolutely, one of the finer American painters. And also we have a work here by his student Frank Wadsworth. And I hung the two together so that you could see the similarities. They're only separated by about a year, these two paintings, The Red Roofs of Bristol by Chase and The Horseless Carriage of 1900 by Frank Wadsworth. But I hung them together to show the similarities in color and brushwork, the student looking at his teacher. But also, I want to talk about this momentarily as an example of what makes American Impressionism different from the French.
Okay.
This picture perfectly embodies, at least I think, the American spirit of innovation, of new technology, is exemplified by the Model T, and that American expansionist spirit, the interest in exploration, the open road.
Okay, it's a wonderful painting, and I do see what you're talking about as far as the American spirit is concerned.
And Barbara, before we look at our final painting, I want you to note this spectacular painting by Frank Benson. He's a Boston Impressionist, called Sunlight.
No, it's wonderful. Now, this is the last one we're going to get to see today, but there's certainly going to be an opportunity for our viewers to get out to see the show at Philbrook. How long is this show going to be?
It's here till November 29th, so it's here for a long time, so everyone can get a chance to see it.
Great, and give us your hours.
Philbrook is open Tuesday through Sunday, Tuesdays through Saturday, 10 to 5, and open late on Thursday nights until 8.
Oh, great.
And Sundays we open at 1 o'clock until 5.
Okay, well, we hope lots of people get out to show us one.
Absolutely, because I want them all to see this spectacular painting, another spectacular painting, another beautiful painting by Frederick Hassam, who, with 9 other painters, founded what really became known as the Impressionist Society, but they were called the 10 American Painters, and Hassam and Benson, whom I just mentioned, were 2 of those painters. And this is one of the finest paintings in the exhibition of Gloucester Harbor, off the coast of Massachusetts. And here, Hassam and several other, quite a few other artists came to paint. And here you have this just idyllic, practically, this idyllic view of the sunlit water and the rocky terrain of the shoreline. And the magnificent thing about this painting is I encourage everyone that comes to see the show to get very close to this painting and look at how Hassam conveys these issues we've been talking about. I constantly mention color and texture and light. And these elements are so vividly depicted in this painting by his taking his paintbrush, and instead of using the soft bristle end as he daubed the paint on, he'd also take the end and scratch into the painting. So you see these little motions, these lines that make waves.
Yes.
This is how he conveys, by scratching into the painting these wavy lines, the motion of water, or the leaves of the trees. He makes these circular marks. And so it becomes an incredibly vivid and beautiful depiction of a sunlit day on Gloucester Harbor.
Well, it's just wonderful, and you know, the technique things are very interesting. I think that's one thing we all need to keep in mind, once again, when we're looking at Impressionism, is that the technique, as you said earlier, was really the message. Well, Richard, we appreciate your being here for Focus on Art. We'll look forward to being back at Philbrook again. For those of you at home, we appreciate your being with us as always. We'll look forward to having you back again for Focus on Art.